Hey y'all, Melissa here with you today, and today I'm answering one of your sewing questions. How do you sew faux fur? And I'm actually going to expand this question besides just fur. I've got plush fleece, I've got fake fur, I've got sherpa, I've got regular fleece, and even cuddle minky. And there are tips that will help you with all of these fabrics. So today I'm going to be sharing my top 5 tips for sewing fuzzy fabrics. Tip number 1 for sewing fuzzy fabrics is to understand fabric nap. Now, fuzzy fabrics all have something called pile on them, and it's easier to see that on like faux fur. Pile is all these fibers sticking up that make the fur. So there's this flat backing and then there's the fibers sticking up. Those are the pile. If this was real fur, these would be the hairs, this would be the skin. And so you can think of pile as the hairs of these fuzzy fabrics. Now, pile creates fabric nap. And that's because the pile lays all in one direction on these faux furs and fuzzy fabrics. So you can see it when you touch the fabric. So the pile is all laying this way. That means the fabric nap is going this way. And if I run my finger, you can see how the color changes because I'm pushing the pile against the fabric nap and basically making it stand on end, and because of lighting and shadow, that's going to make it look like a different color. This is important to keep in mind when you cut out your fabric and when you stitch your fabric. This nap is running up, this nap is running down. It's most visible when you're looking at it kind of vertically, and hopefully you can see that. See how the colors change there? Again, nap running in different directions. So if I was to cut out my skirt pieces and the nap is running in different directions, it will literally look like I have used different fabrics even though it's the same one. And I know this because I've accidentally done it before and had to recut pieces to make sure that I didn't have these seams where it kind of looked like at the seam line that it was two totally different colors of fabric meeting up. Pay attention to the nap of your fabric. Tip number 2, consider some special tools to help when you're sewing these fuzzy fabrics or faux fur fabrics. Here are some of my favorites, and I have linked all of these tools in the post below. First, I like to use these clips to hold my pieces together. Pins do not work well with these fabrics because they're thick, so the pins tend to get bent out of shape and or slip and get lost inside the pile, and that can't be a good thing when you're trying to wear it later and you're getting poked with a pin that got hidden in there. So I prefer to use clips when I'm working with these types of fabrics. Also, because pins don't work well, I like to use pattern weights. This set I ordered from Thanks I Made Them, and I like to use these to put the patterns down on my fabric because then I can weight them down and I can trace them out since the pins don't work well. Also, because of pins not working well and having to weight the patterns down and trace, I like to use these washable children's markers for marking. Then you can mark this on the back side of the fabric. If you happen to be working with a fabric that is plush on both sides, it doesn't have a flat back side, sometimes you can still even mark with these if you use the correct color for your fabric. Any other type of marking besides like thread marking with basting stitches is pretty impossible with fabric that is plush on both sides. It's really hard to mark on piles, so washable markers are a great tool. These are applique scissors, and sometimes they're called duck scissors or duckbill scissors because of this blade that has that shape. And what this does is it helps you cut pile out of the seam allowances should you choose to do that in your construction. And I'm going to demonstrate that later when we talk about stitching, but if that's something that you're going to do, these might be worth investing in. And then I like to use the same needle in almost every sewing project that I do, as I've talked about in my video about sewing needles, which I have linked below. So most of the time I use an 80-12 universal needle. On Faux fur, that's one of the times where I will change needles because I want to go to a bigger size. Thicker fabrics usually need a bigger needle, so I'm using a size 116 universal needle. The base of most of these types of fabrics is a knit fabric. So if you're having trouble with the universal needle, like skipping stitches, you might want to switch to a stretch needle with these types of fabrics because the base of the fabric that the pile is put into is knit stretch fabric. Finally, I like to use a walking foot on my machine. Because the fabric is so thick and then it's got that pile, it's very easy for your fabric to kind of like the pile like move and then you end up with your seams not aligned. And that's part of why I want to use clips instead of pins to help keep those raw edges together. But another way to help make sure that the two sides are feeding the same is to use a walking foot. It replicates the action of your feed dogs that push the fabric from underneath. It does the same thing kind of on top so that the fabric is feeding evenly and you don't end up with like, it's quite possible to get offset fabric if you don't use a walking foot. Tip number 3, cut carefully. So we talked about nap and pile earlier and the direction of the nap on the fabric, and you want to keep that in mind as you're cutting. You want to cut your fabric in a single layer. So you want to lay your fabric. Usually I do this wrong side up, and you want to be aware which direction the fabric nap is running. So if I check on this one, my nap is kind of running in this downward direction. If I push this way, it's moving the nap up. And this faux sherpa fabric, like the nap is not as pronounced as it was in that plush fleece that I showed you, but it does still have a nap. So if I'm laying my fabric out single layer, then the way you're gonna do this is where my pattern weights come in. You kind of weight it down, use the washable marker, and trace it out. And then, because I'm cutting in a single layer, but I need symmetrical pieces, because this mitten piece actually does have a symmetrical notch here for thumbs. So I need one going this way and one going this way. What you need to do then is flip your pattern over so that you have the opposite piece from it. And then you would weight that down and trace it out. And then, when you're cutting, after you have placed your pattern, you've traced your pattern onto the fabric, you're going to want to cut with the direction of the nap. So you notice like the nap was kind of going this downward direction. So instead of starting up and going around and down like I would on normal fabric, especially if you're doing something with like fur where the pile is really thick or this sherpa, you're going to want to start kind of at a midpoint and keep the blades of your scissors pointed in the same direction as the nap. So I would want to cut this side, and then I would want to cut this side down like that. Now when you're cutting across, like you can go either way because you're cutting across the nap. But if you're going to be going, if your choice is going against the nap or with the nap on your cutting, you want to go with the nap. Finally, you want to have really sharp scissors for this. All of these types of fabrics are made usually from like 100% polyester synthetic fibers, and that can be really hard on your scissors. So if you're going to be doing a lot of work with these types of fabrics, you might want to consider getting your scissors sharpened before and after you're done with all of that work, because this type of fabric will dull your scissors. And the same goes for your serger blades. If you're going to be using a serger at all for these types of projects, you might want to have an extra blade for your serger because it will dull and then possibly stop working for thinner fabrics when you switch back to other fabrics. Tip number 4, stitch carefully. Let's talk about some different stitching methods for faux fur, especially because generally if you're using a fur, you want to try to kind of hide the seams. So let's take a look at some ways to do that. I've got some samples here in front of me. So one way to do this, let's say I'm going to sew these two edges together on my, and that was going to be my seam. So one way to do it is to place them right sides together and to remove the pile from those seam allowances before you stitch it. And that's where these duck scissors come in handy, or applique scissors, because as you can see, they kind of prevent you from cutting that base, but allow you to trim the pile out of the seam allowance there. Don't trim too far in, but I'm going to be using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so that's a good amount to trim out. And then I'll clip this together and we'll take it over to the machine, where I'm going to want to sew with a zigzag stitch here. So I've got my walking foot on. I am using a long and wide zigzag stitch, and I'm going to try to stay fairly close to the raw edge. All right, you can see my zigzag stitching here. And now when I open this up, kind of want to run a finger on there, and you can see this really looks like, unless you look really, really closely, this kind of looks like one piece of fabric. The pile just kind of covers over where that seam was, and you can't see where it was joined. The second way you can do this is you can do a kind of a joining seam. I've heard it called a hinge seam as well. This is a flat construction method. So with this, you would cut the seam allowances off, and then you would actually just butt the edges of the fabric up against each other. So let's take this to the machine and I'll show you what that one looks like. All right, you can see my zigzag stitching here. And now when I open this up, kind of want to run a finger on there, and you can see this really looks like, unless you look really, really closely, this kind of looks like one piece of fabric. The pile just kind of covers over where that seam was, and you can't see where it was joined. The second way you can do this is you can do a kind of a joining seam. I've heard it called a hinge seam as well. This is a flat construction method. So with this, you would cut the seam allowances off, and then you would actually just butt the edges of the fabric up against each other. So let's take this to the machine and I'll show you what that one looks like. We're still using a wide zigzag stitch and a fairly long stitch, and the trickiest part is getting the edges aligned at the beginning. And then what you want is these two edges butted up against each other in the middle. So one side of the zigzag will land on one fabric, and the other side will land on the other fabric. Okay, here is a super close-up of what that kind of seam looks like when it's butted together. It's pretty flat. Let me show you the other side. So it's actually more visible than the first kind I did, but let me show you how to hide that. You're going to want to take a pin, and then in the zigzag stitching here, use the pin to kind of free the fur up from within where it's caught in those stitches. This can be time consuming and tedious, but it does result in a flatter seam on the inside if that's important to whatever you're constructing. So you can see once you run the pin through that, it really hides the seam and it looks like one piece of fabric. Tip number 5, cleaning. You might be a clean as you go person. You might not care if there are tumbleweeds of fuzz all over your studio. Whichever one you are, you're going to want a vacuum cleaner. Either you're going to be vacuuming frequently while you're working, or you're going to wait until the end and just have a whole bunch of fuzzy piles to vacuum up. But one way or the other, a broom is not going to cut it for working with this type of fabric. And if you enjoyed this video and you have maybe a sewing question of your own, I have a link in the post below where you can submit your sewing questions. And there's a playlist here that is full of sewing questions that other people have submitted that I have answered. So you can check those out as well.